Welcome to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence. Today we'll be studying Joshua chapter 10. Now, Joshua chapter 10 is essentially the taking of the south part of the Promised Land. There's going to be 5 cities here that will rise up against Gibeon, who had made peace with Joshua through subterfuge. And Joshua is going to come against them. There's a very famous passage that takes place here, a famous event that we'll cover when we get there. It's a fairly long chapter, but it's very straightforward what happens, and there's a lot of repetition in here as each of these 5 cities or 5 kings is taken out. So let's get started. Joshua chapter 10 and verse 1. Now it came to pass when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard about how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so he had done to Ai and her king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men thereof were mighty. Wherefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent unto Hoham, king of Hebron, and unto Piram, king of Jarmuth, and unto Japhia, king of Lachish, and unto Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up unto me, and help me, that we may smite Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and the children of Israel. So you have this king here of Jerusalem, and he is seeing what Joshua and the Israelites are doing, and he sees that individually Jericho and Ai were not able to stand against Joshua and his army. Now, of course, there's that whole part about God taking a major role in all of this. And so what he says is that, standing alone, we're all going to fall. And so he goes and gets all of these other kings, 5 kings all together, and they go not against Joshua, but against Gibeon for making peace with Joshua, for somehow being able to escape from the wrath that was coming against these wicked people. And it's got to be reminded here of a couple of things. Number one, these people are wholly wicked. God had let them fill up their wickedness. He gave them opportunities to repent. There were good men among them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were among them. And it wasn't that God just kind of left them to themselves. You had people like Jethro, the priest of Midian, who was around and about. There were people that were there trying to teach them what it was to live righteously. And they just became more and more and more wicked. You had more city-states like Sodom and Gomorrah that just became wholly corrupted. So these are wicked, evil men. And the other part that I want to kind of emphasize here, because Joshua is one of those chapters or one of those books that people will go to a lot to attack the Bible. And I want to emphasize something about death. Death as part of creation, because death was definitely a part of creation, was just a doorway. It was just a transition. From God's perspective, death was just a transition from this temporary life into eternity. That's all death is, as far as God created it to be. We go to the book of Hebrews. It says it is appointed unto men once to die. That means that it was part of the design. And so when death comes upon people, as it will come upon everybody, it is just the transition from this temporal life into eternity. And if we have that perspective, it becomes easier to understand what God calls Joshua to do here as he goes through and wipes out these wicked people. If you wipe out nation after nation after nation of adults who are absolutely wicked, those children that they have that are innocent are going to have potentially a horrible life, that they are going to grow up starving on the streets. There's a lot of horrible things that they would have to endure because the nation of Israel would not be able to absorb that many children into their own. Number 2, you leave behind a legacy of children who will grow up and potentially be just like their parents, learning about their own cultures, following after their own gods, and ultimately wanting to get revenge. When we see warfare, there is death. But again, from God's perspective, death is just a transition into eternity. So in warfare, God commanding Joshua to go in and take these people out, including whatever children happen to die during this wartime. God is basically bringing those children of wicked parents to himself, because the children are innocent and they are transitioning into eternity without ever having to deal with sin and wickedness and the loss of their eternity with God. So God, who is the creator of all life, is justified in taking any life whenever he sees fit. And he is justified in using whatever tool he sees fit to do that. Even though we understand what happened with Abraham and Isaac, that there was a purpose behind what God was doing, God was justified in telling Abraham to sacrifice his son. When we see God telling Joshua and the Israelites to go in and conquer and kill everybody, God is justified in taking those lives, and he is justified in telling Joshua and those men of war to be the instrument of that. And it's because God is the creator of all life, and because death is just a transition into eternity. Today, when we are looking at faithful Christians, people who maybe they've lived a long life, maybe they haven't, but death comes upon them as faithful Christians, what does Paul say? To live is for Christ, but to die is gain. And so when we go through this and we see all of these people dying, those who are in fact innocent, and there's no explicit look at Joshua. It doesn't say that Joshua killed all the babies. It doesn't say that Joshua went in and slew all the children. But if we allow that conclusion, if we allow that that's probably what happened here, those children have gained. Is it a sad thing? It is, from the perspective of they will never grow up and have the capacity, or have the opportunity, I should say, to make the choices for or against God. But God, who is omniscient, knowing the future, knowing all possible futures, is in this sense giving a gift to these children. And I know a lot of people are going to be upset with me for saying this. He's giving them this gift of transitioning into eternity without sin. And the alternative is worse. The alternative is worse. And we, who see all the other things that God has done for mankind, must trust that God is making the best choice. In every place that God commands, God is making the best choice. And while it may hurt our feelings, and while we may feel certain ways about the things that God commands to be done, our hearts are not what's supposed to lead us. It is our minds. It is our rational side. It is the part of us that's created in the image of God that trusts in our Creator to do the right thing. And I believe this firmly, and as I have had to deal with this from a very personal perspective, having had this thrown at me on a pretty constant basis, maybe not so much in the past year or so, but pretty regularly, this is what has been thrown at me for people that I have been close to, that I am close to, leaving the faith. I've had to study this head on, face first, for almost a decade now. And all it has done is strengthen my faith in God and my resolve that God knows best what to be done. And that's the choice that we make when we come to the scriptures and we see things like this, that they will cause a stir of emotion. We have to make that choice. Do we continue to trust God? Does our faith in God grow? Or do we set ourselves up as the standard of morality and reject what God has done because we think we know better than the omniscient, omnipotent creator of our universe? And I've made my choice. Verse 5. Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their host, and encamped before Gibeon, and made war against it. So they lay siege, these 5 kings with their great armies lay siege to Gibeon. And the men of Gibeon sent unto Joshua to the camp to Gilgal. Remember, they're in Gilgal still. This is their first camp, right outside, right across the Jordan, right outside of Jericho. They're at this camp Gilgal. This is where all of their women and children and everything is completely camped, because they haven't really pushed too far into the promised land yet. And so these guys send to Joshua, saying, Slack not thy hand from thy servants. Come up to us quickly, and save us, and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. So here we have the Amorites. This is the people who are of essentially descended from the same person, but they've kind of diverged into these 5 different city-states. And remember, there's an oath that Israel has sworn to Gibeon. And part of that is they're a vassal nation now. And so the city-state of Gibeon is this vassal nation, and Joshua owes protection to them. So Joshua ascends from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, all the mighty men of valor. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. So God is that we see here God responding now to this oath. The oath was made, and we see God responding favorably. He accepts the oath, he understands the oath, and he is going to help Joshua keep that oath. And so he says, Go up against them and don't fear, because I'm with you. And they're all going to die. Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly, and went up from Gilgal all night. So he does this forced march all night. And Jehovah discomfited them before Israel, and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goes up to Beth-horon, and smote them to Azekah and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass, as they fled from before Israel, and were in the going down to Beth-horon, that Jehovah cast down great stones from heaven, from the sky, upon them, and unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than whom the children of Israel slew with a sword. Alright? So these stones are hailstones. This is not rock, this is hail, and it's big. And so you have this giant hailstorm that God causes to happen as these armies of these 5 city-states are fleeing. They've already been wiped pretty, like we talk about the word decimated. It's not really a good term. Decimated just means you took a tenth away. These guys are hit hard by Joshua, but not the majority of them. And then they turn and flee because they see that Joshua's forces are going to win. And so God causes this hailstorm to come, and the hailstorm kills more than what Joshua's men killed at Gibeon, even though it was called a great slaughter. And then here's the famous event. Most of your Bible class kids will hear about this, probably not the really, really young ones. And we hear this watered down. This whole chapter is a little bit watered down and softened. The realities of what's going on here when we're teaching the elementary kids and the junior high kids. But we have this war, and we have this slaughter that takes place. And then God sends this hailstorm to kill many more than even Joshua and his host did with a sword. And then we have this famous event. Then spake Joshua to Jehovah in the day when Jehovah delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. Okay, now I want you to just think about the physical reality of what's happening here. And I also want you to pay attention to how this relates to authority, because the sun and the moon are symbols of authority in apocalyptic text. Joshua is commanding the sun to stand still. What is he actually doing here? Because when we think about what's going on here, we're talking about rotational mechanics of the planet. If the sun is not moving in the sky, it means the planet is not rotating. If the planet is not rotating, then the centrifugal effect of a rotating object, if you think about it, if I were to take a bucket of water and attach a string to the bottom of the bucket, and that bucket's filled with water, and I start slinging that bucket around, that water's all going to pour out. It's going to be flung out in a circle. We feel a less effect from gravity as the planet spins. If the planet stops spinning, the feel of gravity will be much more intense. Also, the moon stops orbiting the Earth. From a physicist's perspective, the amount of power that God is exerting here, he doesn't just cause the sun not to move in the sky. Because it's not just a light that stops in the heaven. We're talking major suspension of physical laws and realities here. And for God, stopping a planet from spinning while maintaining the same gravitational effect, causing the moon to stop orbiting while still maintaining the homeostasis of the tides, the amount of physics that is going on with this that we aren't really told about here in the text because it's not really pertinent to the text. But the amount of physics here that is going on is just mind-blowing. But for the creator of the universe, one tiny little planet, not that big of a deal. He created the entire universe. But from our perspective, wow, it is so powerful. And God listens. Verse 13, and the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. Now I want to talk about this book of Jasher here in a minute. But you have an entire day where the earth essentially stops rotating. And all of this time that Joshua is pursuing these people, it remains light. Now, what does that have to do with authority? When we talk about God being authority, the power that he has over creation, the power he has over the sun and the moon, and then we see the sun being commanded by Joshua, who is God's man, we see the sun providing light until the command of God to take these guys out is carried out. There's this whole synergy that's happening with the physical anchors for the metaphors of the sun and moon when we start looking into the books of prophecy. So keep that in mind here, this idea of the sun and the moon and their attachments to authority and all that Joshua was able to accomplish here by the power of God. Now, what is this book of Jasher? The book of Jasher is not an inspired book. It is just a reference to it would be like if Paul knew of the works of Josephus. Was Josephus inspired? No. Was he a contemporary historian during the Jewish wars and the time that the New Testament was still being written? Yes. If Paul had referenced Josephus, that doesn't make Josephus inspired. But it would be something that the people would know about. They would know who Josephus was. They might have known who Tacitus was. Paul does, in fact, reference non-inspired works because they were very well known, and to the people of that time, it was a reference that made sense. For the Israelite people, they knew what the book of Jasher was. Do we know? Do we have a really good idea? No. Do we have the book of Jasher? No. But this is something that would have made sense to the prime audience. And this is where understanding the prime audience comes into play. It's a very powerful thing to understand that we're supposed to interpret the Bible from the prime audience's perspective. Because even though we don't have an idea or a really complete picture of what the book of Jasher is, we know that the Israelites knew what the book of Jasher is. And so the reference that Joshua makes to this makes sense. And it's some kind of historical document that records this event. And for a time after this event takes place, you have this kind of external source that corroborates what happened here until Joshua was able to write down his own book, the book of Joshua, which was indeed inspired. It says, "And there was no day like that before it or after it, that Jehovah hearkened unto the voice of a man, for Jehovah fought for Israel." So you have this unity here of God's purpose and man and God's will and what he has promised them. And so this really powerful, we think of Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea is a big deal, or the crossing of the Jordan is maybe a lesser big deal. And we look at those events and we're like, wow, the crossing of the Red Sea, that was no way. This was way, way more. This event here is beyond all of the plagues of Egypt, beyond the crossing of the Red Sea. It is one of the most powerful displays of God's might in the entire Bible. And that's why you see there's no day like that before or after it. And here you see man's will completely united with God's will. And that's why Joshua was able to ask God to do this kind of thing. Verse 15, "And Joshua returned and all Israel with him unto the camp to Gilgal." So they rout the armies, destroy the armies. The armies are gone. But the 5 kings fled and hid themselves in a cave at Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, saying, "The 5 kings are found hid in a cave at Makkedah." And Joshua said, "Roll great stones upon the mouth of the cave, and set men by it for to keep them." So they're going to trap these 5 guys in the cave. And they've got guards on the outside. All right? And then he tells his men, don't stay there. Pursue after your enemies and smite them. Take them out. Smite the hindmost of them. Suffer them not to enter their cities. Don't let the remnants of the armies to get back to their cities. For Jehovah your God has delivered them into your hand. So it comes to pass, when Joshua and the children of Israel had made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter till they were consumed, that the rest which remained of them entered into fenced cities. So you have this small little bit who enter into these walled cities. But for the most part, the armies, remember, these are the massive armies of these 5 city-states that came out to fight Gibeon. And they just lost that. There isn't enough left to defend those cities, so they came out and essentially brought themselves as an army to be slaughtered before Joshua and the Israelites. And now there's nothing left to defend those cities. It's very easy to take these cities. And all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. None moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. So, not like the spies in Numbers 14. These guys, yep, we did it, we're good. And all they had to say was positive stuff. Then Joshua said, "Open up the mouth of the cave, and bring out those 5 kings unto me out of the cave." And they did so, and they brought forth those 5 kings unto him out of the cave: the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. So these guys fled, they hid, while their armies were being killed. And it came to pass, when they brought out those kings unto Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said unto the captains of the men of war which went with him, Come near, put your feet upon the necks of these kings. And they came near, and put their feet upon the necks of them. And Joshua said unto them, Fear not, nor be dismayed, be strong and of good courage, for thus shall Jehovah do to all your enemies against whom you fight. So Joshua brings these 5 guys out, and then the guys that were the heads of the army come, and they put their feet on the necks of these kings in a symbolic fashion, showing that they would conquer not just these 5 cities, but that they would continue to conquer everything that God had promised them that they would conquer. So you have a different perspective. Now, are the Israelites perfect as they conquer the promised land? No, we've already seen Gibeon was a problem. Ai started off having problems before they kind of turned that around. So there isn't perfection here. But you have a very different picture from the beginning of Numbers, when they should have been coming into the promised land. And the spies come back. Remember, 10 of them were like, we can't do this. There's no way we can do this. Here, these guys go off, and they're taking out these 5 armies, and they come back and they say, yeah, we got this. There's nothing, they're not saying anything bad. So Joshua brings these 5 kings out, and they do this display in front of all of the army, and they say, just like we did to these guys, remember, these are 5 mighty cities, and these are the kings of those cities. Joshua says, just like we did to these 5, we're going to do the rest. We got this. God is on our side. And so he says, fear not, be not dismayed, be strong and of good courage, because God, Jehovah God, is going to do to your enemies the same thing that we just did to these guys. And then verse 26, after Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 trees, they were hanging upon the trees until evening, till the sun goes down. Remember, this is a long day here. And it came to pass at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down off the trees, and they cast them into the cave where they had hid, and laid great stones in the cave's mouth, which remain until this very day. So they take them down off the tree, they're dead. They put them back in the cave that they had hid in, put the stone back over it, and it's still their grave at the time that Joshua is writing this letter. Okay, verse 28. And that day Joshua took Makkedah, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof he utterly destroyed them, and all the souls that were therein. He let none remain, and he did to the king of Makkedah as he did unto the king of Jericho. Now, the understanding that I have is that there's also a driving out that is taking place. So when Joshua comes to this city, you've had people that have fled by this time. And so a lot of the kind of the heart-rending that you have people when they say all the souls that were therein were killed. That's the babies and the mommies and all of the emotional arguments that are made. But at this time, who is actually remaining in the city? It's the defenders, the people who decided to stay instead of those who were driven out. Because we go back to the book of Numbers, we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, when God is preparing, he talks about driving them out, and I highlighted those in those videos. And so when they arrive at Makkedah, it's all the souls that are therein. It's all the souls that remain that did not flee and try to leave the promised land altogether. Okay, so he did unto the king of Makkedah as he did unto the king of Jericho. Then Joshua passed from Makkedah and all Israel with him unto Libnah, and fought against Libnah. And the Lord and Jehovah delivered it also, and the king thereof, into the hand of Israel, and he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein. He let none remain in it, but did unto the king thereof as he did unto the king of Jericho. And Joshua passed from Libnah, and all Israel with him, unto Lachish, and encamped against it, and fought against it. And Jehovah delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, and took it on the 2nd day, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein, according to all that he had done to Libnah. So he's going through, and he's taking these city-states one by one. He takes Makkedah, which was not part of the 5. If you go back up to the original 5 cities, at the very beginning here, you have Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. All right, those are the 5. But when he finishes taking out those armies, the first city he comes to is Makkedah, The next one he comes to is Libnah, and neither one of those are part of the five. But then he comes to Lachish, which was one of the five, and he took it after the second day. They siege it. It takes 2 days. So their victories are coming very swift because Jehovah is with them. And then again, smote it with the edge of the sword and all the souls that were therein, according to all that he had done with Libnah. Now again, I will say, all the souls that were therein. Remember, Lachish is one of those five armies. They don't have much there defending. So the town is for the most part. Why is it so easy to take? Part of it is because there's nobody left. These towns have a skeleton crew, if you will, that are there. Everybody else is either fleeing or dead already because they were part of the army. And so Lachish is taken out. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua smote him and his people until he had left him none remaining. So you have another king comes up and tries to assist, and Gezer is taken out. Gezer is not one of the cities that were in the beginning. So we've got 3 additional ones. We're up to 8 cities now that have been taken. And from Lachish Joshua passed into Eglon, which was one of the original 5, and all Israel with him, and they encamped against it and fought against it, and they took it on that day, one day. Remember, there's no army left. And so when they siege these towns, it's super easy for them to take them. And he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein he utterly destroyed that day, according to all that he had done to Lachish. Joshua went up from Eglon, and all Israel with him, unto Hebron, that was one of the original, and they fought against it. And they took it and smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof, and all the cities thereof, and all the souls that were therein, and left none remaining, according to all that he had done to Eglon, but destroyed it utterly, and all the souls that were therein. So everybody that's left in Hebron, remember again, Hebron was one of the original 5. Their army is gone, very easy to take. And Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to Debir, one of the original, and fought against it. Debir is, or was that the name of the king? Yeah, Debir, king of Eglon. So this is Eglon. Let's see here. No, Eglon was already taken in verse 34. I'm sorry. So apparently there's a town named Debir, named after the king. So this is another city that's taken. I got those a little mixed up here. But he took it, and the king thereof, and all of the cities thereof. Now note, and every single one of these, we're talking about a single city and a king of it. These are city-states that he's taking out, like Sodom and Gomorrah were city-states during the time of Abraham. And he took it, and the king thereof, and then you have all these little vassal cities around it. All of the cities thereof, and they smote them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed all of the souls that were therein. He left none remaining, as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir, and to the king thereof, as he had done also to Libnah and to her king. And Joshua smote all the country of the hills, and of the south, and of the vale, and of the spring, and all the kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as Jehovah God of Israel had commanded him. Joshua smote from Kadesh Barnea. Why is that name familiar? Because Kadesh Barnea is where the spies went out from. Okay, Kadesh Barnea is where the spies came out from when they went in to spy on the land. Even unto Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even unto Gibeon. So where is Goshen? We're talking about all the way across the Sinai Peninsula, the northern strip of the Sinai Peninsula. Where's the river of Egypt? It's the Nile. Where does Joshua take? Where was Joshua promised? He takes everything from Goshen across Kadesh Barnea, up Gaza, all of this, even to Gibeon. So he is taking the entire south portion of the promised land, and even goes all the way back to the land of Goshen. Promise fulfilled, right? And all these kings in their land did Joshua take at one time, because Jehovah God of Israel fought for Israel. And Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, unto the camp to Gilgal. So they finish taking out, they take out 9 kings, 9 major city-states, and all the little villages and towns and stuff that are kind of satellites of those, and they take them out. They're completely done. There is this mighty campaign into the south part of the Promised Land that captures everything, even all the way back to Egypt, even all the way to the point where the spies were supposed to have gone out and given a good report. They didn't. All of that is taken. And it does not take long. Notice we were talking about 2 days here, 1 day here. Of course, there's marching times in between. But this is happening very rapidly. Joshua is already an old man. Remember, he is one of those that came out of Egypt. He was already over 20. He's 40-something by the time he's a spy, right? Because that it tells us that I think he was 40, 41, something like that, when he is a spy and he goes in. He wanders for 40 years in the wilderness, so he's 80 years old by the time this campaign starts. And then he sees the whole campaign through and writes this book. And so this is happening very, very rapidly. Did God fulfill his promise to the Israelites in this time period? He did. He does. Because then you have the 2.5 tribes that are able to go back to their families when this war is over. And we see this happening so rapidly that it isn't this long, protracted thing so that these guys never make it back to their families. It's very swift and very powerful, and it's because God is with them, because they are remaining faithful to God. So that wraps up Joshua chapter 10. Hopefully we're making pretty good pace here. These videos are turning out all right in terms of quality, and hopefully we can continue pushing through like this, and we'll finish the book of Joshua here in the next month or so. There's only, I think, 24 chapters. So thank you for joining me on this journey. I look forward to your questions. My name is Ernie Lawrence, and this has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation, and we will see you on Joshua chapter 11.